I need a detox off of dopamine. I'm in dopamine exhaustion. We talk about dopamine. Everyone talks about dopamine. Dopamine. So in the nucleus accumbens, there's dopamine. But the interesting thing is that all of this stuff has been oversimplified. So I'm going to add some complexity to it, but even I'm going to be oversimplifying. So they took a group of mice and they basically did a really interesting experiment where they injected different stuff into the nucleus accumbens of mice. So generally speaking, they took mice and they gave them two options of food. One is like a high carbohydrate, super tasty, like Twinkie pellet. It's basically like a pellet that's like a Twinkie. And the other is like a regular food. And they normally have to work a little bit harder. They have to like press a lever to get like the Twinkie versus like the kale salad, okay? So generally speaking, when you give mice this choice, what'll happen is they'll go for the Twinkie, they'll go for the high carbohydrate, nutrient dense food, and they'll eat it and they'll be happy little mice, fat little mice too. So what some researchers did is they injected a certain amount of dopamine blocker into the brains of these mice. Okay, so we're going to kind of go back to this for a second and let's see what happened. So I'm going to have to figure out how to draw this. So let's say you've got a mouse and then the default is high energy pellet. And then the other option is low energy pellet. So normally in the situation that our normal situation, let's call it blue. So normally a mouse goes this way and they choose the high dopamine pellet, okay? So then what researchers did is they blocked dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. So in the nucleus accumbens of mice, they took a dopamine blocker and they blocked dopamine. And what they actually found when you block the action of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens is that mice will actually go this way. Okay, so if we block dopamine, that's because these are a little bit harder to get. The other way you can kind of think about it is that they have no preference for the high energy pellet over the low energy pellet. And then they did something really interesting. They took a third chemical, adenosine, and they actually blocked the action of adenosine in the nucleus accumbens. And what they found is that the mouse went back to the high energy pellet. Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit because neuroscience is complicated, but most people who talk about dopamine don't talk about it in a complicated sense. So there's three states that we can kind of think of in terms of dopamine and adenosine. Okay. So let's just talk actually for a second about what adenosine is. So adenosine is essentially a waste product in the brain. So we have this like the fuel of our brain is something called ATP. And the waste product after we burn a molecule of ATP is to wind up with adenosine. And we know adenosine does all kinds of stuff. So I'm oversimplifying things. But the other thing that we know is as the day goes on, so like if we think about, time of the day in adenosine, okay, what happens over time as we go throughout our day is adenosine slowly climbs. And then we go to sleep. And then what our brain does is clear adenosine from the brain, and then this is waking up. So as the day goes on, we increase in our adenosine. So what I would kind of say, and if we kind of think about dopamine for a second, okay? So when you wake up first thing in the morning and you feel really excited to play a game, so let's say this is dopamine, and let's say this is time. I'm super excited to play a game. I really want to play Dota. There's a new patch. The first game of Dota I play gives me a lot of dopamine, right? This is an oversimplification, but dopamine signal is a better way to put it. And then the more games of Dota I play, essentially my dopamine starts to go down. So this is why when you kind of look at like behavioral reinforcement, right? So this is why people will say like at the beginning of the day, like that's when you like, if you're productive at the beginning, you're going to have a good day. Whereas if you start playing video games, like it's a lot easier to do work for 2 hours and then start gaming than it is to play for 2 hours, stop, and then start doing work. So our dopamine, generally speaking, like we get more bored of crap by the end of the day. We're excited to do things. But by like 7 p.m., 8 p.m., you're like, if you've been playing games all day, you don't really feel like doing much, right? And then we go to sleep over here. And then we kind of wind up back here when we wake up, if we're lucky. So if we kind of look at it, there are kind of three states of dopamine and adenosine throughout the day. And remember, this is a waste product, right? So we can have high dopamine and low adenosine. So this is in the AM. We can have low dopamine and low adenosine. We'll get to this state in a second. Or what we can have is low dopamine and high adenosine, okay? And so if we kind of think about it, when we block, so this is a state where when we block dopamine and we still have adenosine, remember we end up going for the low energy pellet, right? So when we block adenosine as well, then we end up either going for both or we end up going for the high energy pellet. So you can almost think about adenosine and dopamine as having antagonistic properties. So adenosine will blunt the effect of dopamine, okay? So what is the dopamine counter? It is adenosine, okay? Is the dopamine counter. So you guys may wonder a little bit about this and why this actually works. So like, let me give you guys kind of like an example. So if you guys ever like studied, like let's say you've got a final the next day, right? What time do you usually start studying? If you're like me, you don't start studying first thing in the morning for the final the next day. You procrastinate until 2 p.m., 4 p.m. You're like dicking around. You're like, I should study, I should study, I should study. And then once, Gigi. Once 6 p.m. rolls around, you're kind of like, once 6 p.m. rolls around, you're kind of like, oh man, like it's somehow like easy, like as time goes on, you get like a little bit less distracted. And like, then suddenly it's like easy for you to study, right? In the morning, it's actually like super hard for you to study, but almost as you get fatigued by like towards 4 p.m., 6 p.m., 7 p.m., it becomes like easier for you to start studying. And then you stay up all night, you pound caffeine, and then you kind of get into what I would call like the fatigue groove, for lack of a better term, okay? So like the fatigue groove is like when you're actually like really functional, but you're kind of tired. And in a weird way, you can get into this fatigue groove easier than you can like at the start of the day when it's so easy to get distracted. Does that sort of make sense? It's almost like games are more tempting at like noon than they are at like 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. And then like you kind of get tired and then it's sort of like you get into this weird fatigue groove. And what I'd call that fatigue groove is essentially this adenosine buildup throughout the day. So as like our day goes on, and we kind of think about it this way. So like, let's call dopamine green, okay? So dopamine kind of starts out high, easy to get distracted, video games. And then let's call adenosine yellow. And then like you kind of start adenosine over here. And then like this is sort of like 6 p.m. and this is when you start studying. And then you study all night, you're kind of fatigued. And then like when 7 a.m. rolls around, your exam is in an hour, and then you kick yourself, right? And you're like, man, if I had started like 4 hours earlier, 6 hours earlier, if I only started studying a little bit earlier, I could have gotten so much more. But it was so hard to study so much earlier. And I think part of that is adenosine. So it's interesting because our ability to get distracted by stuff. I'm sorry, I couldn't see this. So this is dopamine, this is adenosine. And then, so you start out with dopamine over here, high, and then over time it goes down. And then with adenosine, let's call it yellow. And then it increases. And then this is kind of your 6 p.m. switch where you start studying. Okay. And this is also where like we can kind of think a little bit about night owls, right? So there's actually there are a lot of situations where we can see people are actually more productive like later in the day. And that may have something to do with like adenosine production in the brain. And so then the question becomes like, what's the relationship between these two things? And it's that when we're vulnerable to our dopaminergic activities early in the day, like when you feel excited to play games, you kind of want to watch stuff, like it's really hard to work. And then once you kind of get into this like fatigue groove in the middle of the day, the dopaminergic pull decreases on its own. And then like adenosine, remember adenosine has a blunting effect on dopamine, right? That's what the key thing about this rat study is that it demonstrated how adenosine is the dopamine counter. So adenosine is a waste product in the brain, and that sort of makes sense too, because the more that our brain does things, the more energy it uses up, and the more energy it uses up, the more tired it feels, and the less it feels like doing things. So since adenosine is the dopamine dopamine counter as the day goes on. It must our ability to like respond to dopamine or be controlled by dopamine. And then we can start studying at like 6 p.m. after procrastinating all day. Okay, so that's the first thing. So the first reason why I think you can sometimes get motivated is because your motivation gets distracted by dopaminergic activities early in the day. And then as you start to get fatigued, like you don't feel like, the dopaminergic pull isn't there. You're not thinking about playing games anymore. You're not like, oh, I really want to do this, so this would be kind of fun. And so as all of the desires and the dopaminergic control starts to fade into the background because of elevated levels of adenosine, then like the deeper motivation can start to shine forth because it's not just this dopaminergic crap anymore. Does that make sense? So that's one thing that has to do with neuroscience. So now let's talk a little bit about future discounting.
Hey, good morning, Vern. Hope you're having a wonderful, wonderful Friday morning. We're just hanging out doing our morning speaker, Dr. K this morning. He's getting scientific as fuck this morning. I'm trying to follow along too, but yeah, it's good so far. I always love how he breaks down the neuroscience. All right, here we go.
So if we talk about, what the real problem is, motivation is a feeling and it increases at night, right? So motivation increases at night. But now here's the question. Does behavior increase at night? Right? So when you feel super motivated at night, do you engage in the behavior? Interesting, right? So when we go to bed at night, there's a really interesting thing about motivation, which is that there's no cost to motivation. So our motivation can like increase unchecked. It can spiral out of control. You're sitting there like late at night and you're thinking like, oh, tomorrow I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. It's going to be great. It's going to be awesome. Like I have all of this motivation, and in our brain, there's no cost because you're not giving anything up. You're not actually doing anything. So it's like your motivation can like rise to epic proportions because there's no cost to the motivation. There's no balance to the motivation. Now, when you wake up the next morning, what's the situation the next AM? Now you have a choice. Motivation versus video game. So let's say that at night, I think about, oh man, I'm going to write a novel, right? So this is the other thing. Creative stuff, right? Happens a lot at night. I'm going to write a novel. So now I have a choice. I can write a novel or I can play a video game. And now suddenly there's a cost to the motivation, right? So if I write a novel for 1 hour, have I written a novel? No. Have I written 1% of a novel? No. There's no like cost benefit. Like there's no like, what have I done in an hour? So my brain is sitting there and it's doing, this kind of goes back to this other calculation, like the behavioral calculation. And my brain is sitting there in the morning and it's thinking like, okay, if I like, can I write a novel now? No. Like, can I write a novel in an hour? No. Can I write a novel in 2 hours? No. Write a novel in 4 hours? No. So can I actually write the novel in the morning? No. Now, can I play a game in an hour? Yep. Can I get a little bit of that? Can I get that dopamine? Can I get me a little bit of that dopamine, please, ma'am, sir? Thank you. Yes, please, and thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Easy. Easy. So now when in the light of day, when you actually have the opportunity to engage in the behavior, there's an opportunity cost now, because at night there's no opportunity cost. So your motivation can just fly through the roof because it doesn't cost you anything. It's like free. Like and then you get more inspired and you think about how great it's going to be. I'm going to have this idea. I'm going to have that idea. Like this character is going to do this. We're going to do plot twist here. It's going to be like no one's going to realize what's going to happen. It's going to get picked up. There's going to be a bidding war between Netflix and HBO for my awesome new novel. It's going to be great. It's like Twilight meets Game of Thrones. It's going to be like the most epic thing since Harry Potter. It's going to be so awesome. There's no cost. In the light of day, now suddenly there's a cost. Like Twilight meets Game of Thrones. Holy crap, that's going to take a lot of work. Like, how do I even do that? There are going to be different vampire houses. Like, what's up with that? How's that going to work? It's overwhelming. I don't know how to start. So let me just play a video game. At least that's easy. Easy. Let me just do this. So in your brain, you have this behavioral calculation. We've talked about the March and Dowd paper a lot, right? So if you guys remember that paper, it's also on our Discord and things like that. So there's a behavioral calculation that in the night doesn't, it's like an equation that only has one side of the equal sign. So the motivation goes out of control because there's no cost. But come the light of day, now suddenly there's a cost. It's like you're going to sleep at night and you're like, man, I'm going to wake up tomorrow. I'm going to work out first thing. And then you wake up tomorrow and it's like, am I going to work out right now? Because do you work out in the middle of the night? Like when you feel so motivated to write that novel, do you actually get up and write? Do you actually work out? No, you don't do any of those things. When the cost actually becomes part of the scale, so we've got, a set of scales, right? And then like the motivation is just, there's a ton of motivation over here. So it's easy because it's empty. So motivation, easy. But now we start adding a cost during the day and then suddenly this is gone and then our motivation goes up or whatever, this wins and then it's GG. Okay. So next thing to consider. So there's like a future discounting problem. There's an opportunity cost problem. It's not really, the future discounting is another one of these principles where like, our brain chooses, the reason I call it future discounting is because our brain chooses an immediate gain over an uncertain long-term gain. So like I can get some immediate satisfaction right now, but come the light of morning, like I don't actually know if anyone's ever going to bid war over this because I've been writing for an hour and it sucks. There's no plot twist. Like I can't, there's no, it's not successful after 1 hour. But if I play a game, it's like easy, done. So now what I want to talk a little bit about is almost what I would call spiritual. It's not really spiritual, but it's not scientific. And I think like the yogic folks like understood this stuff like a little bit better. And so what I'm going to talk about now about why, this is the third reason why motivation is higher at night is shower thoughts. Okay. So if you think about shower thoughts, like what's so interesting about the shower? Like when you're in the shower, you're in this kind of like a state of consciousness where you're not really distracted. You can't be on your phone. You can't really like do a whole lot with your mind. There's like no mental distraction. And there's some amount of physical roteness, right? You're just like, hopefully like shampooing yourself, cleaning your hair, things like that. And then what happens is like this combination of factors leads to profound thinking. And now now let's look at the situation when we go to bed. So like, I mean, if you're on your bed, you're not going to have, if you're on your phone in bed, you're not going to have motivation. You guys see that? If you're sitting there watching something or browsing something, you're not going to feel an ounce of motivation. It's when you go to bed. It's when you put down your phone. There's nothing left to mentally distract you. So you're just sitting with yourself. There isn't necessarily like a physical roteness, but there is sort of like a physical pull or grounding, let's say. Maybe that's a better feeling, right? And so we see a very analogous situation to actually showering, and then we result in like motivation and thinking. Right? This is the situation in bed. The reason I call this kind of like spiritual in nature is because I think yoga, like the yogis and stuff were the ones that really looked at these different states of mind and figured out how do we cultivate this kind of state of mind. And so what we can see is that a lot of that motivation naturally bubbles forth when we are free from distraction, when we have no dopaminergic options at hand, and we are being with ourselves. Right? So this is like a phrase that we use where when you go for a walk in nature, when you shower, when you lay in bed at night. And the interesting thing is that even like technically someone else can be there, like you can lay in bed with your partner or whatever, but as long as you guys aren't interacting, this state will come. So the reason I call it spiritual is because it's about like, this is the angle where I think about cultivating a particular state of consciousness. So if you want that kind of motivation to hit you in other parts of the day, we already have figured out showering, right? So this one is like, there's even like shower thoughts is a thing. We see it when we go to bed at night, but you can actually cultivate these states by walking in nature, by doing away with the dopaminergic distractions, right? Because at the end of the day, this is going to increase dopamine. Or like when you're on your phone, it's going to increase dopamine. When you play video games, it's going to increase dopamine. And so this kind of goes back to like this state over here, where these meditative practices, this is actually the ideal state. So this is why if you really look at people like I, for example, do my most productive work in the morning. Where if I spend 15 minutes on my phone at the beginning of my day, if I sit down at my computer, my productivity is going to be like at 80% of what it was, sometimes even less. The longer I spend at my computer first thing in the morning, the more screwed I am for the day. Whereas most of my like thinking, my high quality thinking happens before I hop on the dopamine train. So avoid the dopamine train. Okay. Takeaways. Number 1, avoid the dopamine train. Number 2, adenosine gets you off the dopamine train. So this is the fatigue groove. But the problem with the fatigue groove is that you're fatigued, right? It's not like adenosine. Like adenosine is a waste product. So at this point, like you're fatigued. So even though you can work, you're not as distracted. The quality of your work is going to be like 60 to 80%, right? And so number 3 is like what you really want to cultivate. And this is like where kind